This is Venezuela, a country that has suffered one of the greatest economic and humanitarian crises in modern history. Today, it appears Nicolás Maduro and his government are prepared to negotiate an agreement that might end U.S. sanctions and pave the way for free and fair elections.
Everybody knows that he's lost the election. He's the emperor who has no clothes. He's cracked down.
Venezuela used to be the biggest oil exporter to the United States, bigger than Saudi Arabia. But since 2019, U.S. sanctions have kept the country from selling most of its crude and forced it into default.
Imposing economic sanctions on the knowledge that this is going to hurt the population as a whole.
The human cost of Venezuela's hyperinflation can be seen at every bank in Maracaibo. It is the cash point queue from hell, where your money is worth less than when you join the line, and all you can withdraw is the equivalent of 12 pence.
In 1973, Venezuela was the wealthiest country in Latin America and one of the 20 richest countries in the world, ahead of countries like Greece, Israel, and Spain. Its oil reserves were among the largest in the world, producing over 3.8 million barrels of oil per day. Its citizens enjoyed a higher standard of living than many in Europe. Fast forward to today, and the picture could not be more different. How did a country so rich, so full of promise, fall into such chaos? This is the story of Venezuela's rise, dramatic collapse, and its uncertain future. Venezuela's story of wealth begins with a discovery that changed its destiny: oil. In 1922, the Maracaibo Basin erupted with crude oil, marking the start of Venezuela's journey as a major player in the global petroleum market. By the 1920s, the country was producing so much oil that it accounted for nearly 10% of the world's supply. By the mid-20th century, Venezuela was reaping the rewards. With oil exports booming, the nation became one of the richest in the region. In the 1950s, Caracas, Venezuela's capital, was often referred to as the Paris of South America. Its infrastructure, public services, and education system were the envy of many neighboring nations. On December 6, 1998, Hugo Chavez was elected president of Venezuela, ushering in a new era for the country. At the time, Venezuela was known as one of the wealthiest nations in South America, with the largest proven oil reserves in the world. The nation's economy was heavily dependent on oil exports, which made up more than 90% of its total revenue. But Venezuela's rise began long before Chavez. In the early 20th century, the country was an agricultural economy with a modest population. Everything changed in the 1920s when vast oil fields were discovered. This discovery transformed Venezuela into a major oil exporting nation. By the 1970s, high oil prices brought unprecedented wealth, leading to rapid urbanization, improved infrastructure, and a growing middle class. However, dependence on oil became both a blessing and a curse. During boom years, the government spent heavily on public programs, subsidies, and social welfare. By the time Chavez took office in 1999, he introduced a wave of socialist policies under his Bolivarian Revolution. These policies focused on wealth redistribution, nationalization of key industries, and extensive social programs aimed at reducing poverty and inequality. Chavez's government nationalized the oil industry, which further increased government control over revenue. High oil prices in the 2000s funded large-scale welfare programs including free healthcare, education, and food subsidies. This approach won Chavez widespread support among the poor. By 2012, poverty rates had dropped from 50% to around 30%, and literacy rates improved significantly. But there were warning signs. Critics argued that Venezuela's economy was too reliant on oil, and when prices were high, the government failed to invest in other sectors. Corruption was also a growing concern. Despite massive oil revenues, inefficiencies and mismanagement plagued state-run enterprises. By 2013, when Chavez passed away and Nicolás Maduro took power, oil prices started to decline sharply. The government, instead of cutting spending or diversifying the economy, resorted to printing more money to cover the shortfall. This led to rising inflation and economic instability. By the 1980s, Venezuela's reliance on oil became a glaring vulnerability. The global oil market took a downturn, and with it, Venezuela's economy faltered. A significant drop in oil prices meant less revenue, and the government, heavily dependent on those revenues, struggled to maintain its lavish spending. Debt began to mount, and economic instability took hold. After Nicolás Maduro took office in 2013, Venezuela's economy faced its biggest challenge yet. Global oil prices plummeted from over $100 per barrel in 2014 to under $50 by 2016. For a country that relied on oil for more than 90% of its export earnings, This was catastrophic. The government, instead of adapting to the crisis, doubled down on its policies of price controls, nationalization, and increased state intervention. One of the first signs of collapse was hyperinflation. By 2015, inflation had reached triple digits, and by 2018, it skyrocketed to an unimaginable 1,000,000%, according to the International Monetary Fund, IMF. Prices of everyday goods, such as food and medicine, increased so rapidly that salaries lost their value within days. In 2019, Venezuela's inflation rate hit 10,000,000%, making its currency virtually worthless. People had to carry stacks of cash to buy basic items, and many turned to bartering. Food shortages became widespread due to government-imposed price controls. Many businesses could no longer afford to operate under these strict regulations, leading to empty supermarket shelves and long lines for basic necessities. Essential goods like flour, cooking oil, and toilet paper became luxuries. Meanwhile, Venezuela's once thriving healthcare system collapsed, with hospitals lacking medicines, equipment, and even electricity. By 2019, nearly 90% of Venezuelans were living in poverty, and malnutrition was on the rise, especially among children. Politically, Maduro's government became increasingly authoritarian. In 2017, he created a new legislative body, the National Constituent Assembly, which essentially stripped the opposition-controlled National Assembly of its power. Protests erupted across the country, with thousands demanding change. But the government responded with crackdowns, arrests, and violence. Human rights organizations, such as Amnesty International, reported widespread abuses, including extrajudicial killings and torture. The international community reacted with concern. The United States, the European Union, and several Latin American countries imposed economic sanctions on Venezuela, targeting its oil exports and key officials within the government. However, these sanctions further isolated the country and deepened the economic crisis. Some argue that sanctions worsened the humanitarian situation, while others claim they were necessary to pressure Maduro's government. To make matters worse, millions of Venezuelans began fleeing the country. By 2020, the United Nations estimated that over 5 million people had left Venezuela, seeking refuge in neighboring countries like Colombia, Brazil, and Peru. This exodus created one of the largest displacement crises in modern Latin American history. Despite the hardships, Maduro remained in power, relying on the military and loyal government supporters. Attempts by opposition leader Juan Guaido to claim the presidency in 2019, with backing from the US and other nations, ultimately failed to remove Maduro. The political stalemate left the country divided and without a clear path forward. With oil revenue drying up, the Venezuelan economy collapsed. Hyperinflation skyrocketed, reaching over 65,000% in 2018, according to the International Monetary Fund, IMF. Today, Venezuela remains a nation in crisis. Despite years of economic turmoil, the government of Nicolas Maduro continues to hold power, while the country's population struggles with persistent economic hardships, political uncertainty, and social instability.